If you could have a camera running on the tomb in and around 33 AD, that an actual Jesus would have walked out on the third day after his crucifixion and burial.
The argument against it goes, look, all these witnesses were likely to have been pretty primitive, mostly illiterate.
A camera on the tomb. Witnesses dismissed as primitive and illiterate. These three phrases frame one of the most volatile debates in human history: the resurrection of Jesus Christ, either the most documented miracle in history or the most successful lie ever told. No middle ground exists. And in this conversation, biblical scholar Wesley Huff walks directly into that fire, armed not with theological arguments, but with something atheists claim Christians never have: historical evidence. When Piers Morgan brings a guest onto his show to discuss faith during Easter, viewers expect the usual dance: belief versus skepticism, science versus religion. The conversation that goes nowhere because both sides speak different languages. But Wesley Huff doesn't play that game. He's a biblical scholar and historian who's captivated millions by doing something unexpected. He treats the New Testament like any other historical document, applies the same rigorous standards historians use for Caesar or Plato, and lets the evidence speak. And what the evidence says makes both believers and skeptics uncomfortable. Morgan opens with his usual honesty. He's a Catholic. He believes. But he's also tired of watching atheists dismiss everything in Scripture as fairy tales, while they can't answer basic questions about their own worldview, like what existed before the Big Bang, or what nothing actually means. It's a frustration millions share. Faith gets mocked as intellectual weakness, while materialism gets a free pass on its own unanswered questions. But this conversation goes somewhere different, because Wesley doesn't come to preach. He comes with manuscripts, archaeological evidence, and a challenge. If you're going to dismiss the historical claims of Christianity, you need to explain why you're using different standards than you use for everything else in ancient history. The central question lands early. Does historical evidence support Christian faith, or does faith exist despite the evidence? Morgan wants to know. And what unfolds over the next 50 minutes isn't just a defense of Christianity. It's a masterclass in how evidence, reason, and faith can coexist without compromising any of them.
A Catholic, was raised a Catholic, and then we get round to the Big Bang, and we get round to, well, what was there before the Big Bang? And they can never answer me. And I get, well, that's exactly why I think there's a superior entity out there, because the human brain cannot tell me what nothing is. So that's where I come from on this. I'm a believer. And this is a special time, obviously, for Catholics, as it is for all Christians. But I'm also somebody that often gets frustrated that the atheist end of the argument often try and decry everything in the Bible, for example, in the New Testament, as all obviously nonsense. And what's interesting about your perspective on this, from your history and your studying, is that you believe a lot of the New Testament is unarguably factually true.
I do, yeah. And I think that that's demonstrable from the actual evidence that we can look at through time and space, with the Bible talking about real people in real times and real places.
Is it indisputable to you that Jesus Christ existed?
Wesley's response cuts through the noise immediately.
Definitely so. I think we can say pretty unequivocally that a character, a first century Jewish itinerant rabbi by the name of Jesus of Nazareth, did walk the dusty streets of first century Roman occupied Judea. I think that even the most skeptical scholars will grant that if we know very little about Jesus, we know that he did exist and that he was crucified in and around the beginning of the first century under the overseeing of the governor of Judea, Pontius Pilate.
Notice what just happened. Wesley didn't appeal to faith. He appealed to scholarly consensus. Even the most skeptical historians, the ones who dismiss miracles and supernatural claims entirely, agree Jesus existed. They agree he was crucified. These aren't Christian claims. These are historical conclusions based on evidence. Morgan then shifts to Jordan Peterson, the clinical psychologist and cultural critic who approaches the Bible with intellectual fascination but religious skepticism. Peterson describes Scripture as bottomless, inexhaustible in its interpretive depth, like a chessboard with infinite paths. It's a beautiful observation, but it sidesteps the question Wesley came to answer.
Yeah, it's interesting, Pierce. I really appreciate Jordan Peterson and kind of the angle that he reveals on the biblical text and some of the kind of allegorical perspectives that it reveals. I don't deny that in the least.
But then Wesley pivots.
In fact, I think I've found Peterson very helpful in his Jungian approach in drawing some of those things out, whereas maybe prior to
This is the line in the sand. Peterson treats the Bible as profound literature. Wesley treats it as profound literature that also makes historical claims. Claims that can be tested, claims that can be proven or disproven, and he's willing to let the evidence decide. The conversation accelerates into territory most faith discussions avoid: the dating of the Gospels, the reliability of eyewitness testimony, the embarrassment criterion, terms that sound academic but carry explosive implications. Because if the Gospels were written within decades of Jesus' death by people who knew him or knew people who knew him, then dismissing them requires more than skepticism. It requires explanation.
there are details within the New Testament that would be embarrassing if they were made up, unless those were actually things that actually did happen and they're trying to be honest.
The embarrassment criterion. It's a historical tool scholars use to determine authenticity. If an ancient text includes details that make its authors look bad, that undermine their agenda, those details are probably true. Because why would you make up embarrassing facts about yourself? The Gospels are full of this. Peter denies Jesus 3 times. The disciples abandon him at the crucifixion. Women, whose testimony wasn't even admissible in first-century Jewish courts, are the first witnesses to the resurrection. Thomas doubts. James doesn't believe until after the resurrection. If you're inventing a story to convince people, you don't include these details. You don't make your heroes cowards and doubters. You don't make women your primary witnesses, unless it happened that way, unless you're trying to be honest.
And I can, explain my reasoning for that. Date the Gospels really far much earlier, within closer to the time frame of Jesus.
Dating matters. Critics often claim the Gospels were written generations after Jesus, allowing myths to develop. But manuscript evidence, internal references, and archaeological discoveries keep pushing the dates earlier. Mark likely written in the 50s or 60s. Matthew and Luke in the 70s or 80s. John by the 90s. All within living memory of eyewitnesses. All within the time frame where people who knew Jesus, or knew people who knew Jesus, were still alive to correct false claims. Compare that to other ancient figures we accept without question. Most of what we know about Alexander the Great comes from sources written 400 years after his death. The earliest biographies of Caesar were written decades after his assassination, yet no one questions their historical existence. The New Testament documents are far closer to their subject than almost any other ancient source. Morgan brings up Ricky Gervais, the comedian turned atheist evangelist who mocks faith with one of the internet's favorite talking points.
I've seen Ricky Gervais, and he says, look, there are 3,000 gods if you add them all up from all the religions.
Wesley doesn't flinch.
I think it's a rather foolish argument in that competition doesn't negate objective reality.
The logic is simple but devastating. Just because people disagree about truth doesn't mean truth doesn't exist. 3,000 wrong answers don't prove there's no right answer. They prove people make mistakes. If we applied Gervais's logic to science, we'd have to abandon the periodic table because ancient cultures believed in 4 elements. We'd reject germ theory because people once thought disease came from bad air. The existence of false gods doesn't disprove the existence of a true God any more than the existence of counterfeit money disproves real currency. In fact, you only get counterfeits when something real exists to copy. Morgan, finding his rhythm, returns to the question that haunts every believer who's ever debated an atheist.
And then we get round to the Big Bang, and we get round to, well, what was there before the Big Bang? And they can never answer me. And I get, well, that's exactly why I think there's a superior entity out there, because the human brain cannot tell me what nothing is. So that's where I come from on this.
It's the ultimate paradox. Atheists claim everything emerged from nothing through purely natural processes. But when pressed on what nothing means, or what existed before the universe, or why there's something rather than nothing, the answers evaporate. Lawrence Krauss wrote an entire book called A Universe from Nothing, where he redefines nothing to mean something. That's not answering the question. That's changing the definition until the question disappears. Wesley builds on this.
And others believe in the virgin birth of the universe. And so a Big Bang requires a Big Banger.
The phrase lands perfectly. A big bang requires a big banger. Critics mock the virgin birth as scientifically impossible, while embracing a universe that exploded into existence from nothing for no reason. Both require something beyond natural law. The only question is which explanation better fits the evidence. But Wesley doesn't stop at philosophy. He pulls the conversation back to history, to evidence, to claims that can be investigated, rather than endlessly debated.
That's what C.S. Lewis referred to as chronological snobbery.
Chronological snobbery. The assumption that ancient people were primitive idiots who believed anything. That first-century Jews couldn't distinguish between a dead body and a living person. That Romans didn't know how crucifixion worked. That 500 witnesses could all be fooled or lying or hallucinating simultaneously. It's intellectual arrogance disguised as skepticism, as if being ancient automatically makes you unreliable, while being modern automatically makes you credible. But the Romans built aqueducts, still standing today. The Greeks calculated the Earth's circumference. The Jews developed complex legal and textual traditions. These weren't ignorant peasants. They knew how to evaluate testimony. They knew dead people stayed dead, which makes the resurrection claim more remarkable, not less. Because these people knew death. They saw it constantly. Life expectancy was 35. Disease was everywhere. Crucifixion was public execution designed to humiliate and terrify. When Romans crucified someone, that person stayed dead. Everyone knew this. So when hundreds of people claimed to see Jesus alive after his execution, they weren't reporting something normal. They were reporting something impossible, and they paid for that testimony with their lives. People die for what they believe is true, but no one dies for what they know is a lie.
The mythology builds up around incredibly famous people.
This is the standard objection. Legends grow over time. Details get embellished. Ordinary people become heroes. Dead heroes become gods. It happens throughout history. Why should Jesus be different? Because timing matters. Legends take time to develop. They need distance from eyewitnesses. They need generations for memory to fade and myth to replace fact. But the earliest Christian proclamation of the resurrection comes from within 5 years of the event. Paul's letters, written in the 50s. Quote, creeds already established and circulating. Creeds that date to the 30s, within years of Jesus' death. That's not enough time for legend. That's journalism. And the content of those early claims doesn't sound like legend. Legends smooth out rough edges. They make heroes perfect and enemies evil. The Gospels do the opposite. They show Jesus frustrated with his disciples. They show him weeping. They show him asking if there's another way to avoid the cross. They show his followers as cowards and doubters. These aren't the marks of mythology. These are the marks of honest testimony. But Wesley knows the conversation can't rest on general principles. It needs specifics. So he goes there.
That's demonstrable from the actual evidence that we can look at through time and space, with the Bible talking about real people in real times and real places.
Real people, real times, real places. This is what sets biblical scholarship apart. Every name, every location, every historical detail in the New Testament can be checked. And for 200 years, skeptics have been checking, archaeologists have been digging, historians have been analyzing, and the results keep confirming the text. Pontius Pilate's existence was doubted until archaeologists found an inscription with his name. The Pool of Bethesda was considered fictional until excavations uncovered it exactly where John's Gospel said it would be. The Politarch officials Luke mentions in Acts were unknown until inscriptions confirmed the title. Every time skeptics claim the Bible made something up, archaeology eventually proves them wrong. This doesn't prove miracles, but it proves accuracy. And accuracy in verifiable details lends credibility to claims that can't be verified. If Luke correctly names obscure officials, identifies minor ports, and describes legal procedures accurately, why would he suddenly start inventing resurrections? Morgan, ever the journalist, wants to get personal.
And what's interesting about your perspective on this from your history and your studying is that you believe a lot of the New Testament is unarguably...
Wesley doesn't hedge.
And I think that that's demonstrable from the actual evidence that we can look at.
Not some of it. Not the parts that fit his theology. A lot of it. Because evidence doesn't care about your conclusions. It exists independent of belief. And when you subject the New Testament to the same historical methods you use for Caesar's Gallic Wars or Tacitus's Annals, it passes every test. Multiple attestation. Documents agree on core facts across independent sources. The Gospels, Paul's letters, the book of Acts, all confirm Jesus' existence, teaching, crucifixion, and resurrection appearances. Enemy attestation. Hostile sources confirm the claims. Jewish historian Josephus mentions Jesus. Roman historian Tacitus records his execution under Pilate. The Talmud, written by Jesus' opponents, doesn't deny his existence. It attacks his legitimacy. You don't attack what doesn't exist. Archaeological confirmation. Sites, structures, customs, and political details align with first-century evidence. The Gospels describe a world archaeologists keep uncovering. Early dating. The documents appear within decades, not centuries. Too soon for myths to develop unopposed. This isn't faith pretending to be history. This is history that challenges comfortable skepticism. The conversation turns metaphysical again, as these discussions inevitably do. Morgan asks about the limits of human understanding, the things that keep him believing despite a world that often seems absent of divine presence. And Wesley meets him there.
Existential questions. How does everything come from nothing? How does order come from chaos? How does life emerge from non-life? How do minds come from mindless matter?
These are the origin questions naturalism can't answer, not because scientists aren't smart enough, but because the questions point beyond nature. How does matter create consciousness? How do chemicals produce thoughts about justice, beauty, and meaning? How does a deterministic universe generate free will? Atheism offers two responses. Either deny the phenomenon, claim free will is an illusion and consciousness is just neurons firing, or punt the question to future science. Assume answers will eventually emerge. But neither approach satisfies. Because we know consciousness exists, we experience it directly. And punting to future science isn't evidence, it's faith in materialism. Christianity offers a different answer. Minds come from a mind, order comes from an orderer, consciousness comes from consciousness. It's not proving God exists. It's showing that theism explains what atheism can't.
If Jesus can change Paul from being a persecutor of the church, Richard Dawkins is far outside of the realm of possibility of salvation.
This is the invitation Wesley extends to skeptics. Not just believe, not have faith, but investigate. Look at the evidence, read the documents, check the claims. Apply the same standards you use everywhere else, and see what conclusion the evidence supports. Because faith based on evidence isn't less than blind faith. It's better. It's intellectually honest. It acknowledges that truth claims should be tested, that beliefs should have reasons, that conviction requires more than feeling. Morgan closes with characteristic wit, imagining meeting Richard Dawkins and Ricky Gervais in the afterlife just to say, "I told you so." It's playful, but Wesley's response reveals something deeper.
And I would really encourage them to say and look into something like the Bible, which I think ultimately gives answers.
This is what separates thoughtful faith from tribal religion. Wesley isn't trying to win arguments. He's trying to share truth. He doesn't hope his opponents suffer. He hopes they discover what he's discovered. Not vindication. Reconciliation. Not I was right, but we can both see it now.
Between you and me, I hope that they come to a place where on the other side, they're going to be in the same place where I am. And that the told you so is grasping it and unity rather than them maybe going some different direction.
Paul the persecutor became Paul the apostle. The man who dragged Christians to prison became the man who wrote half the New Testament. If transformation that dramatic is possible, no one is beyond reach. Not Dawkins, not Gervais, not anyone. What emerges from this conversation isn't argument for the sake of argument. It's an invitation to investigation. Wesley isn't asking anyone to abandon reason. He's asking them to use it consistently, to apply the same historical standards to the Bible they apply to Plato, to examine the evidence before dismissing the claims, to consider that 2,000 years of brilliant minds finding truth in these texts might not be a mass delusion. The resurrection remains either history's most documented miracle or its most successful lie. But it's not both, and dismissing it requires more than skepticism. It requires explaining why hundreds of witnesses lied, why early Christians died for what they knew was false, why enemies confirmed details they could have denied, why archaeology keeps validating the text, and why no body was ever produced. Skeptics often claim extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. But maybe the extraordinary evidence has been there all along, and we've just been using ordinary standards to dismiss it. Because applying the same rigorous historical methodology to Jesus that we apply to Alexander, Caesar, or Socrates leads to one conclusion. The New Testament describes real people in real places during real events, and those events included a resurrection. That doesn't force belief, but it demands explanation. And after 2,000 years, the explanations that dismiss the resurrection are running out of evidence. Wesley Huff didn't come to preach, he came to present evidence. And in a world where faith is often dismissed as wishful thinking while skepticism poses as intellectual bravery, he offers something both sides should want: an honest look at what actually happened in first century Judea. Not what we wish happened, not what fits our worldview, what the evidence supports. Because truth doesn't care about our preferences. It exists independent of belief, and sometimes the evidence for the impossible is stronger than our reasons for dismissing it. The tomb was empty. The witnesses testified. The movement exploded despite persecution. The documents circulated while eyewitnesses lived. The enemies confirmed details they could have denied. The early church suffered and died for claims they could have recanted. None of this proves resurrection, but all of it demands explanation. And after 2 millennia, the naturalistic explanations are growing thin while the historical evidence stands. Maybe the question isn't whether we have enough evidence to believe. Maybe it's whether we have enough courage to follow the evidence wherever it leads. Even if it leads to an empty tomb in Jerusalem and witnesses who saw the impossible.